1 Corinthians 7, we looked at some introductory remarks and verses 1 through 7. Let's start with 8 and 9. Paul says in verse 1, "Now concerning the things of which you wrote to me." And I think we answered the first question last week, and that is, should married couples continue in normal sexual relations after becoming Christians? Paul answers that. Next question, verses 8 and 9, should single persons get married? Verse 8, "But I say to the unmarried and to the," let's see, 8 and 9. "But I say to the unmarried and to the widows, it is good for them if they remain even as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, let them marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion." You're going to see an emphasis throughout 1 Corinthians 7 where Paul said, really, if you get down to it, single's better. But that doesn't mean everybody has to do that. And this is the first reason he says. In normal situations, but for the gifted, such as Paul, celibacy was advantageous, especially in unsettled times. Yes? Yes, sir.
I'm sorry, thanks, Brady. I was just wondering, aren't there those who prefer to get married but maybe don't necessarily burn with passion, so to speak? But, like they prefer it.
Yeah. Yep.
So does this kind of First Corinthians really apply to someone who is maybe thinking that they would benefit more so from marriage than staying single, but they would be okay either way? What if either way?
Yep. I think what Paul's saying, it's a choice. He has a preference from his point of view, but he said not everybody can do that. Not everybody needs to do that. And so it's a choice and not a sin if you don't take his advice on whether being married or unmarried. He says to the unmarried, that's an interesting word. It's just simply unmarried, unwedded, single. And what it means in this context, verse 8, never married, verse 11, divorce, verses 32 and 34, never married. He talks about virgins. So, next question. Is divorce permitted or advised for Christians? And the answer is no. Verses 10 and 11. "Now to the married I command, yet not I but the Lord, a wife is not to depart from her husband. But even if she does depart, number one, let her remain unmarried, or number two, be reconciled to her husband, and a husband is not to divorce his wife." He says, "Yet not I, but the Lord." The Lord spoke about this issue in Matthew 5, 31 and 32, Matthew 19, 3 to 12, Mark 10, verses 10 through 12, and Luke 16, 18. Which means that every divorce involves sin. Not necessarily on the part of both, but at least one person. You just don't get a divorce and say, just choice, got tired. No, that's not it. Sin is transgressing the law, 1 John 3, 4. Whoever sins transgresses the law, for sin is the transgression of the law. So the law, the commandment is a wife is not to depart from her husband, and a husband is not to divorce his wife. So I put this observation here. Please don't advise people it's okay to get a divorce, just don't get married again. If there's any way to prevent it, you don't get a divorce. There's no way to prevent it in our day. It's kind of like the process you're in right now looking for a preacher. The preacher selection process is not It does not begin with trying to hire the right person. When you've been doing these Zoom calls and all of this, it's not trying to hire the right person. It's trying to find out, do we fit? This person I'm talking to, do we fit? Are there any indications this would not be a good marriage? Best time to find that out is before you contact U-Haul. And so the same thing is true when a person is looking for a companion for life. Do we fit? Do we fit? It's not saying, how can I attract that person? How can I please that person? It's do we fit? So it takes two to do that. I've told the story. One place where I was pursued by a church. They said, you're our man. We want you to come. We need you to come and try out so the congregation can think they're having something to do with it. That should have told me something, shouldn't it? We've already made up our mind, but we want the congregation to feel like they're having some input. So went and tried out, got Jerrie W to come in from college. We spent a weekend, already spent hours and hours in interviews with them. And the following Saturday got a report. Dear Brother Barber, because of various considerations, we have decided to look elsewhere for a pulpit minister. I immediately replied. We didn't have cell phones and text back then. I said, thank you. We have successfully gone through the process that we began several months ago. And that is, we don't fit because you say we don't fit. And it only takes one person to do that. And so the same thing is true with a marriage. If a person decides they want to get a divorce, there's not a thing in the world other person can do about it as long as they're determined to do it. You don't have to prove cause. You don't have to have a reason. You can just say, I want out, and they get out. So if it is possible, it's kind of like Romans 12. It's possible. As much as it depends on you, live peaceably with all men, and that includes our partners. Next question, verses 12 to 16. When one partner of a pagan couple becomes a Christian, the other refusing to do so, is such a marriage binding? Verses 12 to 16. But to the rest, I, not the Lord, say, if any brother has a wife who does not believe and she is willing to live with him, let him not divorce her. And a woman who has a husband who does not believe, if he is willing to live with her, let her not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but now they are holy. But if the unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases. But God has called us to peace. For how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband, or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? So, got a couple, one's a pagan, an unbeliever, one is a Christian. Is the person under bondage? And the answer is no. But what does the word bondage mean here? Here's my understanding of what bondage means. Is such a marriage binding? And the answer is yes. But the Christian is not required, that is, under bondage, to renounce Christ and his will to stay married when the unbeliever is determined to depart. And that's my understanding of under bondage. See, you got rules that are often unspoken, unconscious, unspoken, contradictory, and understood. So you have contradictory rules here. What's the rules? Number one, a Christian has a rule that says, I'm going to obey Christ. Number two, they're in a marriage, and as we put it in our day, we plan to stay in there until death do us part, okay? You got an unbeliever who says you either renounce your faith in Christ or I'm going to leave you. Oh, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? I promised Jesus that I would stay with him until death do us part, Revelation 2:10. Whoever is faithful unto or until death is going to be saved. But I also promised my husband that I would stay with him until death do us part. Which one of those am I going to do? You're going to do what Jesus says to do. You're not under bondage to renounce your faith in Christ to keep your marriage in good shape. The word there means to become a servant, to bring into bondage, to make a slave of, to give myself wholly to another one's needs and service, to make myself a bondman to him. In verse 39, we have that another word, but it's a different word in the original. A wife is bound by law as long as her husband lives. That bound is another word which means a tie or knit, to fasten. And so that means that a wife is bound by law to her husband as long as he lives. And then it tells what happens if he dies. So, two different words there. Question that comes up, is that person free to remarry? Remarriage is not discussed in verse 15. See, first, to the married I command, yet not I but the Lord. The wife is not to depart from husband. Verse 12, but to the rest I, not the Lord, say. And so he says, I am addressing something that the Lord did not address. The Lord addresses it. Marriage, divorce, and remarriage, Matthew 5, Matthew 19, Mark, and Luke. However, what do you do if you're married to an unbeliever? The Lord didn't address that. So Paul says, I'm going to address it. That does not mean it's uninspired. It simply means this is just something the Lord didn't say. Everything that Paul writes, there's some people who say, well, part of the time Paul's just giving his opinion. No, he's giving what the Lord tells him, but he says here's something that was not addressed in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. He doesn't say that because Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John had not been written and distributed at that time. But he said, here's what I'm telling you. And he was telling them under inspiration. We'll read later in 1 Corinthians 14, if any man thinks himself a prophet or spiritual, let him admit that the things that I write to you are the commandments of the Lord. So what Paul wrote is commanded by the Lord. So remarriage is not discussed in verse 15. It is discussed in verse 11 and Matthew 19:9. Slow down. Any questions, comments, observations? Yes. Brother Bill, did you have something? All righty. Anybody else? Yes. Yes, and that's what Paul encourages them to do. Who knows? That's not the best way to do personal evangelism. But it is an opportunity. Yes, ma'am.
On that verse 39, the wife is bound by law as long as her husband lives. But if her husband dies, she is at liberty to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. If this widow marries, does she have to make sure?
We're going to get to that in verse 39. We're coming down the road. Good question. Be thinking about it. Yes, sir.
The one you read where the bondage is, she wouldn't be under bondage if she divorces her husband or decides to leave. But wouldn't the rules still apply that if she wants to get married again, she has to go back to her husband?
Yes.
Go back and remarry the guy she was married to?
Yep. Yeah, the rule is don't get a divorce.
The rules don't change, it's just that he's giving you different ways to work.
And probably in that society, she wouldn't divorce her husband. He'd leave her. And so what I think he's saying, you don't have to denounce Christ to keep your husband from leaving you if that's what he wants to do. You don't have to do that. See, you got contradictory rules. Got two rules. Promise I made to Jesus when I was baptized. Promise I made to husband when I was married. Okay, the husband is now saying, unless you renounce Christ and get out of that cult you're in and doing all that kind of stuff, I'm going to leave you. All right, what am I going to do? You can't do both. She says, I have to let you go. If he wants to depart, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases. Next question. Should Christian fathers give their daughters in marriage? Verses 25 to 28. Now concerning virgins, I have no commandment from the Lord, yet I give judgment as one whom the Lord in his mercy has made trustworthy. Again, this is not saying, this is just my opinion, do whatever you want to. He's saying, the Lord didn't speak about this, so I'm going to tell you what I think. I suppose, and here I think is key to several things that he says in chapter 7. I suppose, therefore, that this is good because of the present distress, that it is good for a man to remain as he is. What's the present distress? You know how to answer every Bible question? If you know it, answer it. If you don't, say, I'll try to look it up. And if you don't know, say, I don't know. This is one of those. But there's some kind of present distress going on. May or may not be the same one, but we could understand Matthew chapter 24. Matthew 24, in the first several verses, he addresses the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem. Let's get the context. Chapter 24:1. Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said to them, do you not see all these things? Assuredly I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down. Well, that's a disappointment. See, Jesus just shakes the daylights out of these folks. He said in Matthew 16, we talked about that last week, from this time, Jesus began to say to his disciples, we must go to Jerusalem, suffer many things of the elders, chief priests, and scribes, be killed, be raised again the third day. Wow. And now they say, boy, isn't that a beautiful temple? Yeah. And I'm telling you, before too long, there's going to be a time when there won't be one stone stacked on top of another. It's not going to just get dented. It's going to get torn all the way down. So what happens? Verse 3, now as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the world? Jesus answers those questions, and those are different questions. When will these things be, the sign of your coming and of the end of the world? Verses 1 through 28, When will these things be, and the sign of your coming, that is, coming and the destruction of Jerusalem, and then 29 through the rest of the chapter, the end of the world? Those are two different questions, two different answers. So he answers about the great tribulation. Let's start with verse 15. He gives some. Incidentally, this is something pretty good to remember, just for remembering. A lot of people quote the first, some of these signs from the first 28 verses and apply that to the end of the world. There will be wars and rumors of wars, earthquakes. Did y'all hear about that earthquake? I believe the end of time is pretty close, don't you? That's what it said. Jesus said this would be the signs. We got those signs. Wars and rumors of wars. You know, we've been in war for years. Vietnam and Iran and Iraq, and now just look at it over in Russia and Ukraine, and man, China's getting kind of aggravated, North Korea. I believe Jesus will be here maybe before in the morning at 8 o'clock because all of these signs. That's verse 2 of Jesus is coming soon. So that's one of the songs I encourage folks at least leave out the second verse if you're going to sing the rest of them, because that's quoting from Matthew 24, and that has nothing to do with the end of the world. But when he's talking about the sign of his coming, which happened in AD 70, verse 15, therefore when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to take anything out of his house. And let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. Listen now, I think this has some commentary on what Paul's talking about in 1 Corinthians 7. Verse 19, but woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days. And pray that your flight may not be in winter on the Sabbath. For then there will be great tribulation, such as not been seen since the beginning of the world unto this time, no, nor ever shall be. And unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved, but for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. What you saying? Let me tell you, it's going to be tough on some people. People who are married, people who've got babies, it's going to be tough. It's harder to run when you're pregnant, I would assume. Never been that way, but it kind of looks that way to me. It'll be tough if you got a nursing baby, because not only have you got to run, you got a baby you got to take care of and get enough stuff and feed them, and it's just going to be tough. I don't know it was the same distress because he's writing to Corinth, but it would be a similar distress. So he's saying, you ask questions about young women getting married. I have no commandment from the Lord, yet I give judgment. So here's his judgment. I suppose, therefore, that this is good because of the present distress. That it is good for a man to remain as he is. So he's saying if you're not married, my suggestion is don't get married because of the present distress. But let's read 17 to, well, we've read 17. Let's go 25 to 25. Yes.
I'm just wondering, I don't know if you remember my previous question or not, but say like you meet someone, like a man meets a woman who is very religious and very stout in Christianity. You know, they could read they may have some ways of being closer. So I'm
I don't think there's any reason when a person there's a lot of ways to look at marriage, divorce, and remarriage. Here's the best way I know to look at it. Colossians 3:17. Whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord, giving thanks to God and Father by Him. This is the way I teach it in premarital counseling. When I interview and people want to know my views on marriage, divorce, and remarriage, here's what I say. Whatever you do in word or deed, anything you say or anything you do, do all in the name of the Lord. What does that mean? It does not mean praise the Lord and do anything you want to. The illustration I use, if I'm in a jewelry store and I see a beautiful diamond necklace that costs thousands of dollars, I don't want to pay that much money for it, but I'd like for Gail to have it. The person looks away and I grab it and say, praise the Lord, and got by with that. Because whatever you do in the name of the Lord. No, it's not saying praise the Lord. It's saying by the Lord's authority. Does the Lord give you authority to steal? No. So you can't do that in the name of the Lord. It means what the Lord authorizes. Who can get married? Number one, we've already read it in here. Unmarried people have a right to get married. That's what Paul says to the unmarried. Yes, sir. Yes.
It's better never to marry. But if the desires, fleshly desires overtake you to where you start to be causing you to commit sin and stuff, then you should go ahead and get married.
Yep.
Now, got a question for you also. And that one verse you read there, where it says that it was talking about a woman, but I'm sure it covers a man the same way. That if her husband dies, she can get remarried, but only in the church. Right? And I'm sure that's what he's talking about there. Now, does that mean that if, say that my wife has said, if I want to get remarried, I should find someone here that's wanting to get married the same way. I shouldn't go out and marry someone that's not a member of the church. That's what he's telling us?
We're going to look at that when we get to verse 39. We're going in that direction. And I'm going to give you a couple of choices. So Paul gives two reasons to get married or not to get married. Number one, the present distress. Have we got a present distress? No, not as far as I know. We've got a lot of problems, but we haven't got a present distress. He's going to give a second reason that we'll bump into later on. So back to the way I answer the question. Who can get married in the name of the Lord, by the Lord's authority? Number one, somebody who has never been married. Number two, somebody who has a dead companion, a widow or a widower. And that's 1 Corinthians, well, really, Romans chapter 4, Romans chapter 7. A woman is bound by the law to her husband as long as he lives, but if her husband is dead, she's free to marry. So, number one, somebody who's never been married. Number two, somebody who has a dead companion. Number three, I prefer to use the term someone who is a faithful divorcer, not an innocent divorcer. I choose not to. Most people use that term. That doesn't communicate to me. Innocent means I'm just pure as a driven snow. Never done anything wrong. I'm innocent. Ask Gail. She'll tell you Jerry's not that way. But if a person is faithful to their marriage vow, their companion is unfaithful, and that's the cause for the divorce, then that person is free to marry. So those are Now, who can those people marry? Okay, I'm eligible. Who can I marry? I need to marry somebody who has never been married, someone who has a dead companion, or someone who is a faithful divorcer. Those people are eligible to be married. Okay, we're on the question now, what about virgins? What about young people who have never been married? What should a dad do? NIV puts it in the idea of, I'm a virgin, should I get married? So either one of them, however you translate that, what Paul says applies. I suppose that this is good because of the present distress. It is good for a man to remain as he is. So what does he mean? Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be loosed. Remain as you are. Yes, we're under present distress, but I'm not telling you because of the present distress, just go ahead and divorce somebody. You can run faster than she can, so get out of there and let her make out the best way. No, if you're bound to a wife, don't seek to be loose. Are you loose from the wife? Don't seek a wife. Why? Because of the present distress. But even if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. Nevertheless, such will have trouble in the flesh, but I would spare you. Not a sin, but you're going to have some problems. Why? Because of the present distress. When Jesus was predicting the destruction of Jerusalem, he said, it's going to be tough. There's a day when not one stone will be left on another. They're going to come in and destroy this place. The last couple of times that I went to Jerusalem, I've gone to the burnt house. It's something they discovered between 73 and 96. They discovered in their archaeological work in the city of Jerusalem a house that they are convinced that was burned during AD 70. And it is really interesting. And they've done a video and kind of recreated what might have been happening in that house. It was terrible, absolutely terrible what was done to the people of Jerusalem during that persecution. And it lasted for some time, and finally they went down to Masada, and those 1,000 people who were up there, they were surrounded, and they finally built a ramp out of earth. Front side is just pretty well a rock cliff. Back to the back, it was a pretty big cliff, but they had plenty of time, and they shut them off, and they just started bringing in the dirt, and finally they were able to just walk up there. And when they got ready to go in and capture them, they made an agreement that they would kill each other until the last ones, and they'd commit suicide. I don't know how many of the last 2 or 3 said, I don't see any use in us doing that since everybody else is already dead. So they stayed around and told them what happened. So that was a distress. That was a distress. So, if you're bound, don't be loosed. If you're loose, don't seek a wife. Even if you do marry, you have not sinned. A virgin marries, she has not sinned. Nevertheless, such will have trouble in the flesh, but I would spare you. But this I say, brethren, that the time is short, so that from now on even those who have wives should be as though they had none. And those who weep as though they did not weep, and those who rejoice as though they did not rejoice, those who buy as though they did not possess, and those who use this world as not misusing it, for the form of this world is passing away. But I want you to be without care. Here's the second reason. He says, I really suggest if you're not married, don't get married. And that's it. I want you to be without care. He who is unmarried cares for the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But he who is married cares about the things of the world, how he may please his wife. There's a difference between a man and a virgin. The unmarried woman cares about the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and in spirit. But she who is married cares about the things of the world, how she may please our husband. And this I say for your own profit, not that I may put a leash on you, but for what is proper, that you may serve the Lord without distractions. What is he saying? If you are really dedicated to the Lord, and you can be content and controlled during that situation, you can do a whole lot more stuff than if you had a wife and a bunch of kids. Nothing wrong with that, but you can do more things. And so when I work with churches and we get our ideal preacher, the ideal preacher is 33 years old with 50 years experience. He has a beautiful wife who is nicely dressed and her hair stays in place. The kids sit perfectly still during worship and Bible class. And that's what we want. We put it in the Christian Chronicle, wherever we want to. Probably not all of that, although, boy, there's some. I read one the other night at our transition monitoring team. It tells about a church in a particular place, and it says, you know, we're over 60 and we're stubborn and conservative. So and they printed that in the Christian Chronicle for preachers wanting. So I understand how we desire those kind of things, but I always say I understand that. But it really hurts my feelings that we write a job description that eliminates Jesus and Paul. Because if you find a single person who is really dedicated to the Lord, they can come to your kids' ball games because their kids don't have one. They don't have any kids. And they can do a lot of things because of time. Now, there's nothing wrong with being married, but he said there's an advantage. So he said 2 reasons you might want to stay unmarried if you're not married. Number 1, present distress. Number 2, because of the time that you are able to give to dedicated activities. Verse 35, and this I say for your own profit, not that I may put a leash on you, but for what is proper, and that you may serve the Lord without distraction. But if any man thinks he is behaving improperly toward his virgin, if she is past the flower of youth, and thus it must be, let him do what he wishes. He does not sin, let them marry. So if you got a daughter, and somebody says, I'd like to marry your daughter, don't say, well, it'd be a sin because Paul said so. He said, I'm not saying that. I think it'd be better because of the present distress, stay like you are. I think it'd be better because of the time you can devote to the Lord. But if he can do what he wishes. He does not sin, let them marry. Here's one of the best verses I know on good decision making. Nevertheless, he who stands steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, but has power over his own will, and has so determined in his heart that he will keep his virgin, does well. So what's he saying? If you let your young daughter get married, that's okay. If you decide it's better not to, that's okay. But in making our mind, we need to stand steadfast in his heart. Don't feel like we're being forced to make a decision. We have power on our own will, and we determine this in our heart, then that's a good decision when we're looking at the principles in God's Word. So, then he who gives her in marriage does well, but he who does not give her in marriage does better. See, he's still saying, hey, if you haven't been single in a while, you ought to try. It's working out pretty good for me. I can run and I can serve. And so if I need to run because of the present distress, I don't have to get the crib and the car seat and formula and all this other stuff you have to have when you go across town. You can just get out and take off. So, what some people say is that you need to abide in the calling wherein you're called. What kind of things is he talking about here? He is talking about, and I'm looking for that. Yeah, back up at verse 17. That needs to be underlined. So as God has distributed to each one, as the Lord has called each one, so let him walk, so I ordain in all the churches. Is anyone called circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised. Is any called uncircumcised? Let him not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, uncircumcision is nothing, but keeping the commandments of God is what matters. Let each remain in the same calling in which he was called. Were you called while a slave? Don't be concerned about it. But if you can be made free, rather use it. For he is called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's free man. Likewise, he who is called while free is Christ's slave. And so some people say, well, that means just however you were when you became a Christian, that's the way you do it. No. He's talking about social and cultural circumstances. He's talking about circumcision, uncircumcision. He's talking about slave and free. He's not talking about sinful situations. He's not saying he who is a homosexual, if you are a homosexual when you're converted, then just keep on doing that because you said to abide in the calling with which you were called. If you're called as a thief, just keep on stealing because that's the way you were when you became a Christian. If you were an adulterer, then just keep on living in adultery because that Paul said abide in the calling in which you were called. No. He's not talking about those things. Those things are morality matters. He said circumcision, uncircumcision. That's a cultural and social circumstance. Circumcised, don't have a skin graft. If you're uncircumcised, you don't have to have an operation. They settled that in Acts chapter 15. There were some who were trying to say if you're going to be a Christian, you have to be circumcised, keep the law of Moses. And they said, no, we're not going back to the old law. Why do you try to bind upon the brethren a yoke which neither we nor our fathers were able to bear? If you're a slave, be nice if you could be free, but you don't have to. You can be a Christian. You're talking about paradigm shifts, and it'd be interesting to know how they worked all of them. Think about you're attending a congregation, and here's a man who has slaves, and one of those slaves is an exemplary Christian man. He's blameless, husband of one wife, has believing children, very able teacher, not soon angry. All of those qualities you read about, and the slave is recognized and ordained as an elder of the church. So all during the week, this man is the owner of that slave, and he can tell that man to do whatever he wants to. However, in the church, the slave is a shepherd, is an elder, is an overseer of the congregation, and he is the leader over his owner. Wouldn't that be interesting? But it's possible. So he says, if you could be free, that'd be fine. But if you're not free, you can still be a Christian. No. It is really interesting that Paul nor Jesus really said, we got to fix it by Friday night. I think they set up the teaching that would eliminate it. And Paul encouraged that in the book of Philemon. But he didn't say we got to do it right now. Questions, comments, observations? Okay. We've got about 2 or 3 minutes here, and I think we'll wait till the next time. And we're going to get on, may a Christian widow remarry? And the answer is yes, provided she marries only in the Lord. And what does that mean? And we will talk about that the next time we get together.